in order for Dennis Millarder, a humorist by the figure of Nee Stark, to volunteer in a squad of builders and began to wander around the galaxy for a purple balancer. He was engaged in the development of weapons. In Parevo, he was behind the 30th of the American Army, and he spent a solid profit on casinos, hangouts and walking the younger brother, and for which he very much offended a colleague and a Sirotnik, Lebowski, whose device has been in a dormant state for a long time. His grandfather decided to exist around, although it would be better to go on a drip for a week. Retinews, on brain procrastination. Because somehow I forgot that Tony is in charge, the designer of all the cool military strays, and after his death, there will be no one to develop weapons. The action will be priceless, and the company's profit will be washed away as quickly as a piece of paper in the toilet. Also, the process of eliminating Stark, Obadachik chose the most complicated, through an order to a familiar terrorist, so that he planned and organized a complex attack on an entire military convoy in Afghanistan. After Tony introduces a new weapon, although it would be much easier to give Tony underpants soaked with a beginner so that he falls asleep in bed and wakes up already in a hornbeam. After all, Tony could fly by helicopter and Obadiah and Professor Kolbikuchu money, because of the new one would have to prepare an assassination attempt to beat before you. It would be Grochno. It should be without any sense. Oh, welcome. Well, due to the fact that at Tony's conception, nature overdid the creaking of his eggs, since he does not dare to stand on the blast wave Tariktor and does not fall asleep to drive a local car, teeming with terrorists. The attempt goes as it should. Plus, very successfully, there were no military preparations in the convoy and the car, and instead of taxiing the steering wheel and getting out of here with jammed submachine guns, they got under bullets, right from the side from where they are being fired at. Yes, and Tony is not bestir in the car and do not stick out. I decided to go out for some fresh air. As a result, he learns for himself what it feels like to be in the epicenter of the explosion of his own projectile, and seeing Tony's face from 100 meters away, the terrorists change their minds about killing him, and with the help of Yabash Mandaj, right in front of the American military, teleport him to their cave. Although there is a Rovdi in the colony who survived and actively watered the freaks from large caliber, and then it is unclear how he allowed the thief to go to the rear and pick up the wounded Stark. And since Yabash Mandaj is responsible for everything, then it makes sense to ask how, after the explosion, Tony did not become food for stereotonics, and that after a very difficult operation in the basement, when half of his chest cage was torn open, the next morning he was already cheerful, although at least a couple of months he had to swim and walk around. To calculate all the details of such a complex operation, the doctor would need a powerful laptop. The first Tony Stark is visited by the head physician, who says that his insurance does not work here, but he still has to pay for the operation and a comfortable hospital. And to make Tony think faster, prescribes him a course of water procedures, and since cards are not accepted here, Tony has nothing left as soon as he agrees to the offer. Only what is the point of terrorists forcing Tony to collect one rocket if they can't buy his water and at least 100, although they can give advice to military strategists who buy underwater torpedoes for the desert war. Probably, the fish are silenced in the rivers, and as you know, the head of the terrorists did not kill Stark in order to get more money for him. Then it made sense to force Stark to assemble a rocket, although he just had to be held captive, fed a little and blackmailed by Obadiah until he paid the required amount. And it turns out, absolutely devoid of logic, the act of the ringleader is to force Tony to assemble a rocket. He was needed only to equip Stark with all the necessary materials to create the first version of his armor, and seeing that he was being held captive by idiots, Tony decides to run away from the clinic without paying for treatment. First, he makes a mini nuclear reactor, so as not to take a battery with him everywhere. A reactor that requires the most complicated tools and technical laboratories. It is easier to get into a trash can with a chop jar, and for a full discharge from the hospital, he collects pajamas on hydrofoils for a twisted reservation. What to do? It's as easy as kicking a cat in the balls. It's strange that such a high-level engineer, Tony didn't think to assemble a satellite phone and stupidly call a special rescue team. and due to the fact that cavemen are not able to distinguish a rocket from components, for sure. Tony and his partner without any problems collect pajamas. But due to the fact that Tony put a firecracker for those who decided to enter his room without knocking, the escape is still fired. And then you have to run to the greenhouse to scare the doctors so that the suit can be charged. Only instead of shooting back from around the corner and, to stall for time, a learned doctor for some reason rushes straight into their hands so that they stab him to death with injections. But he still performs his task, and when the nurse comes to check the patient's condition, he does not begin to carry out a free procedure for them, crushing the bones of internal organs, although it was necessary to set the eyes, because he shoots machine guns. No one could get into the holes for the eyes, or into an open reactor. Even the head of the line missed with a grant. And then, as far as the truth is concerned, I stayed in place and waited for an answer from the enemy. Break. And Tony is a handsome guy in general, because when collecting the sweater armor, as a detail, he took all the bazookas and under the trunks, and for which doctors have to calm down a distraught patient with useless firearms. Peddle it. It won't help. Bitch. Bitch. Stupid freaks. And accuse everyone of witchcraft. Stark is a verbal improvisation, cleanses their souls with fire, and after feeding everything he managed to reach, he turns on the first step and repeats the feat. Gagarin. Let's go. True. There is enough fuel for a long time, and due to the fact that Death has gone to take a leak, Stark survives from there, at which he should have turned into jelly. Plus, without having time to weaken the deadly Stushniak, catch a connection with a high cellular connection, and calls himself a Yandex turntable. Good luck, Masuka, and just return to the States. First of all, he closes the production of weapons so that his guns do not fall into the hands of terrorists. But why, when all you need to find out is who is selling weapons to terrorists? And then send them over Nozoliv on his leg. Well, Obadachik, who has not taken pills from the head for a week, began to catch serious hiccups. Not only that, after Tony's return, he again does not think of poisoning him with poison, or Suhovolda, without thinking that the terrorists could find out that he ordered it. So also when he saw that Tony took the mini-nuclear reactor, he reacts to it as to a drunken bat's craft. Although, when there is no such technology anywhere else, any sane businessman would immediately light up his eyes that billions can be earned for this. And Tony realized that turning people into mincemeat is much more interesting than sorting out engines in the garage. Decided to assemble a more pumped version, a human wrecker. Pumps the skill of an engineer for another 100 levels, and in a couple of days builds an even more powerful nuclear reactor, which he puts it in his torso again, because he was seen showing off, walking with a nuclear reactor on his heart, when you can go to surgeons and remove all the shrapnel. Because of such a prophecy, for example, and since, unlike ordinary mortals, in one day Tony Stark is not 24 hours, but under 1,000. In just 11 days, he designs and assembles a new, perfectly working version of the suit, solves the simplest task, how to turn electrical energy into jet propulsion so that the suit can fly and shoot, and from scratch, write software for the suit that the programmers group would have entered several years. Along the way, when God created Tony, he also accidentally turned him into himself, also added a skill, plus a drain, by any undertaking. Because without a single fall, he spends his first flight as if he had been flying in this suit. Since childhood, even the head is not spinning, wild overload, but the blood from the brain still left. Rostin decided to fly to the stratosphere, not taking into account the fact that from the low temperature, his suit, which does not have a mink coat, will be covered with ice. And along the way, even billionaires are not averse, hires cheap gastrobiters. I think Tony is so cardboard that it's unclear how it hasn't collapsed yet. I think that cheap material can be bought and sold, but right in his house he has an excellent breeder for the production of any materials, having told Jarvis about ordering parts with which the suit will not be covered with ice, as the future vision is already beginning to install. I'm starting automatic assembly, really, so fast, and while the armor for intergalactic flights is being prepared, Tony breaks down at a charity party. I'll pay for his money to find out why he wasn't invited to his own party. where he saw his manager for everything, questions in an unusual audion, catches a signal from a junior brother, and proceeds to the maneuver. The name, rolling balls, and when it remains only to bury in the pepperakogel, and take it to an empty room. A journalist emerges at a very bad time, saying that Tony is still bringing terrorists with advanced weapons, with the help of which the Gang of 10 Anal Rings, having scored on free elections, promotes its nationalist party cluster. Well, like all superpowers, is looking for a lantern, and Steve Rogers still unhooks the Wolds and is unable to solve this problem. Tony personally flies into the series, passes several air borders without problems, successfully guesses arrival time, so that the terrorists are still rampaging into the villages, and properly checks for a couple of sheep, the work of new drives and repulsors, plus an experimental model. I prudently screwed the system. Darts, in case of such mass shootings, and having done away with a group of ground-based dumb fuckers, Tony somehow relaxed, and in enemy territory, makes such a relaxed slow flight that it managed to be conducted on him. Some kind of English iron, cotive toyn, which is controlled by Lieutenant and Ushkin himself, capable of ricocheting a shell into a tank. Even from the surface, Mars, who dared to shoot down such a small aerial target, but since this is not a Russian movie, but a normal one, then the local tanker, Tony, with the help of an all-racket, quickly sends it to be stored in a closed coffin, after which he destroys only illegally sold missiles. Tony goes home, although there are still a lot of terrorists in the area, who need to be handed a summons to the next world. But along the way, like Peter Parker, Stark likes to sort out problems, and for the sake of hype in the newspapers, because instead of giving us to the local residents of one of the leaders, he first needed to properly repulsors underwater the heels, and to knock out instead of the position of their main base, as well as who from his company supplies them with weapons, which is actually logical, and yet Tony Stark doesn't really have the money, since he didn't think to equip a suit, air target detection systems. He will pick up a couple of fighters right behind him, only when the Rovd informs him about them on the phone, and it made sense for Stark to turn on the farce and go straight ahead from the plane when he could hang on the spot. The plane would have stupidly flown forward, and Stark was walking freely. Then they were so doomed and exposed to a missile strike, and when he still thinks of letting the Afiki go ahead, then, inexplicably flying past them in a second, turns out to be one on their bellies. Yes. Oh. Bash installation will help in any inexplicable situation. And if one of the pilots was familiar with the concept, keep your distance, then the Pentagon would not have provided damage of 350 million, and such expensive planes, and in them, the most important system for saving the pilot's life is defective. The pilot is lucky that someone is not looking for a kind of telepad, because at such speeds he had to be from the place of variations from the jack by several dozen kilometers, and certainly could not see and know that the pilot of the problems and Spashatom. But the head of Frage in the hospital in the 10 Anal Rings, seeing the new Stark action suit, realizes that with such superhalates, it will be much easier to perform the dinocidal treatment of the population, and showing the Obadoi, the first version's offspring. The impudent mug asks, and what can they be without the most? Tell me the right soldiers. An impudent brute. And no, just to buy back the suit, Obadachik decides to kill the head doctor and take the suit for free to save a couple of $100,000, and at the same time lose the client who buys weapons from him, tens of millions. As such a financier has not yet been kicked out of the company, Obadali has surprised himself, without the brain laid at. Yes, and I gave up. Give it up with piles of scrap metal, from which you still need to make a normal suit, unable to function without a nuclear reactor, which he does not have, because it's much easier to communize Stark's suit, and blow it up along with the house, and so that there are no questions, bribe firefighters who will say that it's just a pop of gas, and thanks to the inhibition of Ubadoi, who did not kill Stark, even after he found out that he started to chop up his clients, he does not decide to find out who is in the company, sells weapons on the black market. And there were times when a white man could still order a woman to go and do his dirty work for him. Go to my office. You need to look for all delivery invoices from the company's server. Women are not P***********. And when Tony was fired a long time ago, they freely let him into the office, where he did not even bother to remove the computer. I also put it connected to the servers. But this is a trifle compared to the fact that a crazy, old man accepts letters from a terrorist directly to the main server of the company. They are sticky mail, and does not even delete them, which provided a mountain of evidence and a couple of life conclusions. And then, the full clinic, at first encouraging, allows Pipir1 to have a free time with them, when he should have realized that she came to Tony's office for a reason, and immediately calls security so that she would not be released. And why does a person bake like that? And Zed, Volmat, Vedabrost, and then Pepper slows down, having met Kolsono, does not immediately tell him that the killer is budding so that he gets a crust. Orbovsky was instantly detained until clarification. But the main thing is that she didn't call Tony right away, and didn't tell him about Obadiah, and why the old man gets into the house and crawls through the gene, and borrows an energy source without permission. But Jarvis didn't tell Tony about the stranger in the house, because he went to watch the kid, and if he had no idea about the characteristics of Tony's reactor, how could he collect a suit that will work on this reactor, and what kind of superintelligent you need to be to think, and some kind of suit, instead of dumping another country until he was put on the wanted list? Well, of course, Obadiah leaves, leaving Tony alive, when he doesn't know what he can put on here, under his pillow. A spare reactor is lying around. Now he will put it on. Put on a suit. Catch up with his grandfather, in the courtyard of the mansion, and perform the kidney procedure. Lowering. But since death has gone to the kitchen, brew, up to wide, Tony manages to crawl to the old reactor. The announced road reports that Pepper decided to play a suicide. If Tony figured out that he would soon have to look for a new assistant, why didn't he call Pepper to tell her to press her ass and not go anywhere? And before flying to her, he didn't tell Rhoda to call a couple of military helicopters to the factory when his old reactor wasn't designed for such a powerful suit, and there is a high probability that right during the fight it will simply discharge. And since Pepper has a telepathic script connection, she knows for sure that Bodiah is now at the factory, in his office or personal villa, and thanks to that Tony didn't call her, and didn't warn her that budding there is a miracle toy. Pepperoni remains alive, only thanks to the fact that, as a child he often ran away from the Gopnik. And why did Bodiah, in general, get into a suit? And what he wanted to achieve with it? Well, he would have patterized the city for a couple of hours until a couple of cruise missiles from the military would have flown into his Labalnik, and when Bodiah practically signed the documents on the transfer of the body of Pepper to the morgue arrives, Tony also demonstrates that because of the water for the production of weapons, cheap guest workers were also built. After that, the cuckoo at Obodiah immediately tells him, "I don't want to leave with you." There is no need to tear off Stark's swing with his steroid suit. He decides to shake his mechanical shoulders. Passing cars. A couple will trample Tony. We will break the road. The city bus and he will shoot Patar Give, from which Tony did not even burn the paint. And I wonder where Bodai put the cylinders with jet fuel in, and Tony's bioreactor does not leave so much beam. Why the hell did he chase Tony at all when he could launch missiles at him? And in the process Tony himself went completely crazy. Ross decided to drive him into the stratosphere for a promo, when he has a super cool rocket, and if he forgot to put it on, then what kind of genius is he? But from the fact that Bodiah has built in his costume function and bashmantage, Tony's attempt to freeze him becomes meaningless, and from helplessness Tony decides to work with Bodiah with good old Kolakami, somehow missing the fact that he's wearing armor here. And if Tony didn't forget to put flashes in his suit before the fight, how did he forget to put everything in? What the fuck else is his rocket? But still Tony collects the visible remnants of reason, and gives birth to the idea to destroy Obadiah by detonating a nuclear. The reactor is right under it, for which it attracts its own pats. And how good it is that the kid is now right next to the reactor. They have been driving home for half an hour, pouring whiskey on themselves, after celebrating their second birthday. Well, since Tony didn't have time to fall off the roof in time, Pepper blows up the reactor right under his boss. But if I'm fried to the bone, then Stark just gets fresher after electrotherapy. Along the way my mother got knocked up from China.